Hello and welcome to our London History Podcast, where we share our love of London, its people and places, and history in 20-minute espresso shots served with a dash of personality. I am your host, Hazel Baker, London tour guide and CEO of London Guided Walks, providing private tours, treasure hunts, guided walks, and live London quizzes to Londoners and visitors alike. Don't forget, we also transcribe all of our episodes, so if you want to read what we are also saying, then please visit londonguidedwalks.co.uk/podcast, click on the episode that you want, and you'll be able to have the transcript in any images or anything else that we will have to share. We put it there. Reviews for our podcast are greatly appreciated. They help us build awareness for the show, which in turn allows us to ensure we bring best value to our lovely listeners like you. You can easily leave a review by clicking on the 5 stars, or you can write a little bit about what you enjoy most about our podcasts. That's enough of that. Let's get on with the show. It does seem that with each year, Christmas in the shops gets earlier and earlier. And especially with COVID, Christmas decorations, even in my house, went up a little earlier than usual. And while I'm on the subject of Christmas getting earlier, why do marketeurs not know when the 12 days of Christmas are? It seems that I'm being bombarded by emails and posts on social media about these 12 days of Christmas as if they're happening now. I'm sorry to burst anyone's bubble, but we are currently in the period of Advent. This year, the 29th November to the 24th of December. The first day of Christmas is Christmas Day, hence its name. Perhaps many of us nowadays are too far removed from the real meaning of Christmas to notice a faux pas such as that. But these days meant something to the Tudors. We're going to go back to a Christmas before industrialisation, even before the Reformation and Puritan rule, before Christmas trees, Christmas crackers, and yes, even Santa Claus. Christmas time in Tudor England had clearly defined rules for living. It dictated what they could and couldn't do, and what they could and couldn't eat. And surprisingly, a Tudor Christmas wasn't so alien as we may believe. Tudors ate mince pies and sang Christmas carols. They even kissed beneath the mistletoe. Advent means coming, as in the coming of Jesus, and it covers the 4 Sundays and weeks before Christmas. And if we were devout Catholic Tudors, then during this period called Advent, we would now be fasting. That meant no meat, dairy, or eggs. That meant very different things to the rich and to the poor. For the rich, it meant supplementing their diet with fish and other aquatic delights, such as porpoise or beaver's tail, rather than their usual beef and venison. For those less fortunate, there was little change. They wouldn't have been able to afford much meat anyway. And about 80 to 90% of Tudor England were believed to have been involuntary vegetarians. That's not because of their ethics or their lifestyle choice, just simply because they could not afford meat. It's estimated that 1/3 of the population lived in poverty. Life for regular Tudors was tough and often isolated. Overwhelmingly, England was a society of small farming communities. People worked and lived on the land 6 days a week, with Sunday being their only day of rest. A small portion of people in the 1500s lived in towns, but it's probably less than 10%. Traditional roles for Tudor women were looking after livestock, preparing meals, making clothes, candles and medicines. Tudor men would typically do the ploughing and carting. 1/4 of countryside households had servants. And Tudor winters were more severe as they were than now, as they were going through a mini ice age. Life expectancy in Tudor England was about 40 years old. And now, with me approaching my 41st year, I feel like I've achieved something, though I don't really know why. But what was Christmas like for normal Tudors? The Advent fast was broken on Christmas Eve with a meat or a fish dish. Perhaps if regular people couldn't afford that, then maybe they added eggs and or dairy to their meal instead. Decorating your home will begin on Christmas Eve too, using bay, holly, ivy and rosemary. It must have smelt delicious. And then after that, midnight mass. Christmas Day is the first day of Christmas. The 12 days of Christmas are known as the 12ths, and these had strict rules. One of those rules was the banning of spinning. And spinning was a primary role of women in the house, and so the spinning wheel, along with the house, would be decorated so they couldn't use it. It was understood that the holy days, Christmas Day to Twelfth Night, was strictly to be taken by all, and work would resume on Plough Monday, the first Monday after Twelfth Night. There was an exception to the rule, however, and that was key workers. The animals still needed to be fed. And remember, that's woman's work. Meals needed to be prepared. Yep, woman's work. So really, what we can say, unsurprisingly, was that the 12 days of Christmas was a holiday for the men of the house. Food plays a big part of a Tudor Christmas, as it does today. During the 12 days, people would venture out and visit their neighbours and enjoy a traditional mince pie. Mince pies, P-Y-E-S, were made from 13 ingredients representing Christ and his 12 apostles. Recipes vary, but most would typically include dry fruits, such as raisins, currants and dried prunes, and if you were wealthy enough, then maybe you would have splashed out on some imported figs or dates. Also in the mix there would have been spices, such as ginger or saffron, and they were a really easy way of showing to your peers how much money you had. Well, more realistically, how much money you had spent. A little chopped mutton would be added to the mixture in remembrance of the shepherds who watched their flocks by night. Have you ever had a minced pie with meat in it? Would you give it a go? Mince pies were sometimes known as shred pies, as the mincing or the shredding of the mutton is required to make the pies. And not long after, dough effigies of baby Jesus adorned these mince pies. And often these pies were baked in a rectangular shape, which then people associated with Jesus' manger. A book of cookery necessary for all such as delight therein was printed by Edward Auld in London of 1591. He had the long shop on poultry, and the poultry counter stocks were right outside the old shop door. Edward Auld himself had spent time in the poultry compter, which was sort of like a small local prison, back in 1568 for printing a pro-Catholic text. And he printed early editions of plays by Shakespeare, including part of the first quarto of Romeo and Juliet in 1597 and third quarto of Titus Andronicus in 1611. He also printed Christopher Marlowe's The Massacre of Paris in 1594. Auld's A Book of Cookery Necessary for All Such as Delight Therein is the first known printed recipe book that we have. And it all happened in London. In the city of London, precise. I mentioned poultry? Well, that is right by Mansion House nowadays, and right on top of Bank Station. Meat plays an important part in Tudor London as well, even if you're poor. Because Christmas was a great big feast, you'd want to have meat on the table, and in the majority of cases, if you weren't a landowner or a freeholder, then you'd be working in agriculture, and that means that you would have a lord and master, and maybe they would give you some meat for Christmas. That is, of course, in return of a gift of their own choosing. For an average Tudor person, Christmas meal might have looked a little bit different than what we would think of these huge chunks of meat. We're thinking something like beef. That was the big meat of Christmas in Tudor times, and they would probably have had more of a stew-like dish rather than a big chunk of meat, or maybe they would have had a pie. This Christmas feast would have had bread. Everybody in Tudor period ate huge amounts of bread, and a seasonal favourite from all classes was brawn. And that was fatty cuts of pork or boar meat, sometimes cooked in wine, and then sliced and spiced and garnished, maybe with gilded rosemary or bay leaves or fruit, or even a sprig of yew whitened with egg or flour to make it look like it had been dusted with snow. And brawn wasn't just for the regular folks, oh no, it was really popular at court, and additional cooking ranges had to be built in the kitchens of Greenwich Palace for the seething and boiling of brawns. Saying that though, it was the choicest cuts of meat, so the forequarters of the boar, that was served to people with wealth, and then the souse, the rest of it, went to the servants. And maybe as a little treat you would be able to have some gingerbread, as ginger was a relatively cheap form of spice compared to some of the others. But if you had money, then you were really able to splash that cash. For the first course, traditionally, it was a boar's head. So this was boned, it was stuffed with forcemeat, it was smeared in mustard from Norwich, dressed in herbs and fruits, with a roasted pig in its mouth, and sometimes even painted with bright colours, or after being stuffed and boiled for 7 hours in red wine, then gilded with gold leaf. And then it was ceremoniously carried out into the room, and it even had its own song that they sang with it as it was being brought in. And too right too, because a boar's head, if you were doing it today in today's money, would have cost tens of thousands of pounds. Now that is a good reason to have a song with your supper. At least 4 of these songs celebrating the boar's head dish survive, but the best known is the Boar's Head Carol, which was printed in Tudor's Christmas Carols, newly imprinted in 1521. And Tudor might be familiar with you, as he was a printer and publisher in London, originally born in Alsace, and he's known for his work with William Caxton, whose printing press he inherited. And he moved to Fleet Street, Shoe Lane area in about 1500, and therefore associating himself with Fleet Street and the art of printing. And if you want to go out and about exploring in London, then there is a plaque to Tudor. It's right by Stationers' Hall, which is round the corner from St Paul's Cathedral. And it says, Tudor, father of Fleet Street, first set up his press by Shoe Lane near this hall circa 1500. And then if you mosey on down to St Bride's Churchyard off Fleet Street, he's actually buried there. He died in 1535. However, we're not quite sure on his plot and whether it was in the yard or the chancel. And Tudor was a very good businessman. I mean, the reason why he moved close to the churchyard of St Bride's was because of the clergy district. They were the chief purveyors of printed literature at the time, so you might as well be right where the money is. And don't forget, Fleet Street has this enduring association with journalism and the printed word, and Tudor was there at the very beginning of that. And don't forget I mentioned the beef was the Christmas meat, but for the poor, meat was a rare luxury. So people usually ate pork or whatever birds they could catch as well. And the better off might enjoy poultry, such as chicken or goose. And turkey is featured on modern day dinner tables, but you may be surprised to learn that turkeys were first introduced to England during the Tudor period. There is a record of the very first turkeys arriving in England from the New World in 1526, and there were 6 turkeys arriving at Bristol, and they were sold for 2pence each. And then in the 1530s, it became a domestic fowl and sold in markets from the 1940s. and became so popular that sometimes it was actually served instead of peacock or swan for Elizabeth I. It wasn't an instant hit. It took centuries for turkey to become more popular than the traditional meats. And the Tudors even had stuffing. It was known as forcemeat at the time, and it was made with currants, so nice and sweet, with the sweet pork and herbs, and also egg as a binding agent. And that was then served with poultry in 1538. Christmas pudding, even today, is popular, and they were eating that in Tudor times as well, although it was a little bit different. But essentially, it was a suet pudding, and a lot of the time, it was the women of the house who had their own book of housekeeping stuff and recipes, and they'd pass them down to their daughters and their daughters after that. And London's Middle Temple Hall is a place with lots of tradition, and this one is with Elizabeth I, who was a patron. The bench table that survives at its head was her gift, and as a welcome to the lawyers that the Queen was said to have baked them a Christmas pudding. And then her recipe was used every year until 1966 as a bit of a commemoration. And then the Queen Mother, back in 1971, she kind of revived this tradition and stirring a new Christmas pudding for the lawyers. I'd love to know what happens now, so if you know, please do let me know and I'll be able to share that with everybody. You probably didn't know that Brussels sprouts are my favourite vegetable, and they were first recorded in 1587 during the reign of Elizabeth I. And there was something on the Tudor table that we don't have really now. And it was a dessert called Frumenty. And it was extremely popular. But essentially it was eggs, fruit, spices, sugar, almond milk or cream, anything you can get your hands on really, added to a mixture of boiled wheat in milk. And after stuffing your face for the whole day of feasting on the first day of Christmas, you are then left with 11 days of Christmas to wassail, to catch up with friends, to play games, to go carolling, and even a lost tradition of mumming. It was 12 days of a fabulous holiday for some, and a lot of work for others. So hopefully this has given you a taste of a Tudor Christmas, and maybe it's got you into the Christmassy spirit. Don't forget, we are offering virtual Christmas lights tours of London, looking at the very best lights that London have to offer. And they're not just in the West End as if it was a physical tour, they're all over. The tour lasts an hour. From the comfort of your home, you can wear a face mask and pyjamas and have a glass of mulled wine because I can't see you. You can just sit back and maybe screen it to your TV and watch it on the big screen. Also, we have private Christmas lights tours, private Christmas carol tours available. And don't forget, we also have our live London Christmas quiz if you think you know more about London and Christmas than me. Let's see. This will be my last podcast episode for this year. I will be restarting again in 2021. So if I don't see or hear from you before then, I hope you have a very Merry Christmas and a healthy and happy New Year.